Hi, I'm Katerina Chowdhury, and I'm welcome to my presentation on gentrification in Madrid. Let's get started. That is Spain's flag, by the way. Madrid is the capital city of Spain. Spain is the third largest country in Europe, located in southwestern Europe, with a population of roughly 46 million people. Madrid has about 6.6 million people, so that's about 14% of Spain's population. You can see here that's central to the country, and it is not touching any water. These are some more maps about Madrid. Here you can see some major streets and some neighborhoods surrounding Madrid and in Madrid, a lot of which we're going to be talking about today. This is a preview to what we're going to be talking about, which is gentrification, and this is a little bit of street art that fights back against the rising housing prices in the city. But before we get started, let's get familiar with some terms critical to your understanding of gentrification in Madrid. So some key definitions that you need to know. Gentrification. This is the working definition of gentrification that I've had throughout this course and that I've changed and updated as I learned more. So this is my definition. The cultural and economic norms of a place changing due to an influx of wealth that often displaces poor residents. That's my definition. There are many definitions of gentrification, but after taking this course, that is the definition of global gentrification that I've come up with. Globalization, the spread of information across countries that corresponds with the spread of democracy and capitalism. Know that they're not really related, but they are in a lot of ways. They correspond together. Leads to international, dependence on other countries. And then the global south. So there's an invisible line that draws the globe in half, and it's called the equator. On the north of it is the global north, and to the bottom of it is the global south. Spain is in the global north. To displace is to remove from an original place. Marginalized are people outcasted by society and pushed to its edges. Revitalization, renewing an area by drastically changing it. A place is specific to a location and time. So we're not talking about Spain in the 1930s or Spain at any other time. We're talking about Spain as it is in 2020. Community is a group of people connected by proximity and culture. With gentrification, the communities that live in a place and occupy a certain territory and their culture changes. Cultural landscape is a definition that I had a bit of trouble with, but it is a geographic area including both cultural and natural resources that is associated with a historical event, activity, or person, or exhibiting any other cultural or aesthetic values. So hopefully with these definitions, we'll give us some context to the situation in Madrid. So gentrification in the city is happening in a few ways, but like many other cities in the global north, tourism plays a big part in Madrid's gentrification. A big part of Madrid's economy is tourism, and that has become a problem for residents because it drives up their housing prices. More and more property in Madrid is being put on Airbnb, a company that many of us are familiar with, but for those of you who aren't, is a short-term rental house website. It's just like a hotel, but you're staying in someone else's home. And about Airbnb, 10% of homes in Lavapiés is a neighborhood that we're going to be talking about a lot. It's that picture on the right here, and it's kind of seen as the prime example of gentrification in Spain, and it's a neighborhood in Madrid. So 10% of homes in Lavapiés were listed on Airbnb in 2018. But City Council has implemented new regulations that hosts can only stay there for 90 days a year. This doesn't necessarily mean that these properties aren't being rented out to tourists and that they're being occupied by locals. It only means that these properties are staying empty most of the year. And 1/3 of Airbnb properties are owned by 3% of hosts. This means that for 365 days per year, 2,177 Lavapiés apartments are off limits to locals. Another disturbing statistic is the third one, that around 1/3 of Airbnb properties are owned by just 3% of hosts, and most of them are actually companies disguised as locals. So they're called superhosts, and they own hundreds of properties each, and have names such as Leticia or Alberto or Elizabeth, when really they're property machines. And all this time, the government is neither addressing the ballooning rental markets nor raising the minimum wage to keep pace with the cost of living, which is what's forcing the poor residents out of the city. Again, this is some street art in Madrid. Street art or just graffiti. It says tourists go home, and it is in Lavapiés, and it is referring to the tourists that come up, and since it's referred to as a trendy or touristic city, their rental prices are driven up. So, to fully understand what's happening in the city, we need a little bit of a history lesson. In 1994, many of Spain's renters were granted a 20-year freeze in order to establish their businesses and communities, but that ended in 2015 on January 1st. It was called the Urban Lease Law, and when it came to an end, Spain's property industry it no longer had that many regulations, and tenants who had been paying for a fraction of market rates now faced a 3- to 4-fold rent increase, or they could have their homes taken off them and throw back onto the rental market. Then the latter started Spain's daily phenomenon to Rosa's story. Rosa, who you can see right here, was thrown out of her home in Lavapiés neighborhood because she couldn't afford her rent increase from, in dollars, $474 to $213 a month. And that jump happened just in 1 month at the beginning of 2015 when the urban lease law was. And this is a problem that is shown in cities like Lavapiés, where Rosa lives, which is also the city that we saw in the last slide. The price of housing increased 21% in the last several years, but this neighborhood also has the lowest household income in Madrid, which is around $28,000. And last year, the average price per square meter went up by 11%. In the rest of Madrid, by the way, it went up by 8.9%. So that's like a 3% increase just in this one city, while housing is being turned into hotels and holiday homes. Rent drives up faster than inflation and wages increase, which is why people like Rosa can no longer afford her home. And so there's this really great quote from this website that I did a lot of research on. It's called Madrid No Frills, and it is this blogger who lives in Madrid, and she is against gentrification, and she has an entire blog dedicated to it. She writes that a home is no longer a home, it's a property, worse yet, an investment opportunity. And she's right. This capitalist dialect is spoken by people with purchasing power, and it leaves people that don't have purchasing power trapped in unstable rental markets. The important thing to note is that it wasn't always this way. This is very recent. Oh, time for a history break. Okay, so when talking about globalization in Spain, it's important to note that it really only started in the 1980s. Before that, for a while, Spain had a dictator named Francisco Franco. In 1975, they transitioned to democracy, which then became a race to catch up with the rest of the world, which was moving and had so many technological and trading advances that Spain did not have because their country was not open. After they transitioned to democracy, there was a shift to globalization. So again, the important thing to note is that modern Spain globalization really only started in the 1980s. And this is important on the context of immigration, which we're talking about now. Another important thing to note is even though there's still more tourism in Madrid and more wealth is moving into Madrid, that wealth is coming from Spaniards mostly. When we think of immigration in the context of gentrification, or at least when I think of immigration in the context of gentrification, I tend to think that people are immigrating to an area are doing the gentrifying, and that's not necessarily the case in Madrid. Since it has gained democracy, Spain has been seen as a refuge for a lot of immigrants in Asia and the Middle East, and immigrants make up a significant portion of the poor residents that gentrification affects. Immigrants make up 1/3 of the population of Madrid in 2006, and now they make up a little under 25%, and that's according to Madrid City Hall. As a comparison, the number of elderly people has decreased by 3% over that same time. So it's not that a ton of people are leaving Madrid, it's a ton of immigrants are leaving Madrid. Meanwhile, middle-class Spaniards are moving in, attracted partly by central location, easygoing old-fashioned charm, and presumably the lower rents compared to the rest of the city. So Lavapiés is considered a low cheaper, but that's no longer the case. In our book, Global Gentrifications, one of the authors that in the chapter that talks about Spain writes that gentrification in Spain has been taking place within the context of a massive influx of more than 5 million migrants to the country. Here is a screenshot of a map detailing the prices of housing around Madrid. The yellow ones are lower housing, and then lower priced housing, the purple ones being higher priced housing. The original graph was on a video and had a lot of other information that was really confusing, so I screenshotted it. But if you'd like to see more about the situation, the link is in the bibliography below. So questions. Is there a specific global process which is being called global gentrification? Great question, and the answer is yes. So this question asks if there is one thing that we can call gentrification, and I say yes, there is. In all the cities that we've studied, there seems to be a pattern for how gentrification happens. Global gentrification has in common that it is caused by influx of money into that area, which goes with my definition of gentrification that I had at the beginning. The influx of money almost always forces a poor group of people out of that place, sometimes for that city to become empty, like parts of Madrid, and sometimes to make way for newer residents. Either way, the city is not the same culturally or economically as before the influx of money. So yes, I do think that there is a definition of gentrification that can be globalized and applied to every place. And how can environment shape the cultural landscape? Madrid is seen as a tourist destination. Its environment is hot, it's airy, it's in the Mediterranean, and it's seen as a place that people want to go. That if it wasn't a place that people wanted to go, if it was super cold, if you couldn't go there year round, if it wasn't central to the rest of Europe, then it wouldn't be seen as a tourist destination, and a lot of the tourist gentrification that we see wouldn't be taking place. So the culture that is taking place in Madrid and the gentrification shift is happening because of Spain's hot environment and its location. So the next question asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of living in the globally gentrified location in the global south, and how does it differ from the global north? Countries in the global north tend to be wealthier. They have better healthcare systems and more advanced technologies and are more politically stable. Obviously, there are exceptions. Not every country in the north of the equator is booming rich, and not every country from the south of the equator is dirt poor either. But with these generalizations, let's examine what's it like to live in a globally gentrified location in the global north versus the global south. And just for context, Spain is in the global north. While not everyone in Spain is rich, the country is still comparatively richer than many other countries, and every person in Spain is still comparatively richer to poor people in other countries. So this is both an advantage and disadvantage. On one hand, people want to move there and they have all the wealth to do it. The country is stable enough so that the investors don't have to flee in a few years so they won't lose their property. But for the same reason, gentrification happens more often, which isn't great if you're the person who can no longer afford rent. So how does gentrification differ from the global north and global south? Money and political stability. The north has it, the south doesn't. And then the Guggenheim effect. This goes with the question asked, provide an example of a cultural process that has shaped the landscape of your selected city. And so the Guggenheim effect just shows that art can transform a city. There was a sculpture, it started in Bilbao, which is another city in Spain, Bilboa, Bilbao, and it shows that bringing art into the place is also the start of gentrification. So what happened here was that it was in a mostly abandoned city, and not a lot of people lived there. It was very poor, and a public art sculpture was installed, and that one sculpture increased, or they predict that one sculpture increased the economy and the tourists to that area like tenfold. So that's something that's also been happening in Madrid. When I looked on many websites, they were talking about how Madrid's a great place to visit and how it's a great, and talking about its art life and its nightlife. And that all starts with art, which is the Guggenheim effect. Time Out magazine in 2018 called La Vie Pièce the coolest neighborhood in the world. Remind you again that this is the same neighborhood that Rosa was getting kicked out of earlier. This is the same neighborhood that many people could not afford rent in. But it's telling people to go there and tour it and be a visitor because it's a super cool neighborhood with tons of art and tons of nightlife. And that's gentrification in Madrid. Here's my bibliography, and thank you for listening.